the waterfront. It was an industry that was very, very... the media had highlighted the things that went wrong in the docks, violence and strikes and all that. Having been brought up as a young Christian, I hesitated to go and work there, but my fiancée at the time decided, well, I'll get better pay and better conditions than I was getting in my trade, and we'll do it for a few years till we save a bit of money to build our house. So my motives for going down there weren't very good. I was not interested in the union or the industry. And I can still remember my first midnight shift. I started at 12 o'clock at night. And as I was walking up the gangway of the ship with all these tough dock workers, port workers, I thought, what am I doing here? Never did I realise that 20 years later I would become the national president of the most militant union in Australia. And I look back, and that comment I put in the paper, in my book, does illustrate that an ordinary fella can make an extraordinary difference. And in my case, it was when I met the ideas of moral rearmament, initiative of change, which my neighbour said to me, Jim, did I want to see the waterfront different? We just had a 3-week strike, and I was very unhappy with the way the union was run. We were always having stoppages that were not necessary, and of course we worked for employers that were very, very tough people. And so when he asked me that question, I said, I certainly do, Tom. I said, and he said, well, where do you think it should start? I blamed the bosses, and I blamed the union officials. And then Tom just quietly said afterwards, he said, well, maybe it could start with you, Jim. Now, as I said, I had no interest in the union. I was just apathetic towards my industry. But when he said that, for the first time, I began to think, am I part of the answer on the waterfront, or am I part of the problem? And I realised I was part of the problem, because I never got involved. I never decided that I would make a stand and fight for issues that were right. I just went along with the majority.
The working conditions were quite tough.
Oh, terrible. My gang, if you didn't load 140 tonne of wheat in an 8-hour shift, you got sacked for what was called insufficient tonnage. That meant I had to carry 25 tonne of wheat in 182 pound bags, nearly 90 kilograms, nearly double my body weight that time, in the 8-hour shift. You were sacked. And some of the cargoes, like asbestos, killed hundreds of waterside workers in their latter years. Were just 2 of the cargoes that and many more that were bad.
And everything was hand labour.
Yes. There was no mechanical equipment in those days. Everything had to be done by hand and taken out. Today, of course, nothing's touched by hand, it's all mechanical, automated.
Yeah, so after you spoke with your neighbour, you thought, okay, I can maybe make a difference.
Well, we spoke for about an hour and a half the first day we met. And I might say that I trusted him, and he was, because we'd been living on our block of land in a brick garage, building our house ourselves. And I would rush home from work and try and get a couple of daylight hours in to do a bit more work. When they moved in, they had a big cluster light on the side of the house. And as it was getting dark, the light would come on. And I thought, gee, this is good, you know. So the first night they were there, the light came on, and I worked on for another hour. But the second night it came on, and I thought, well, maybe coincidence. But after the third night, I realised that he was a good neighbour. So when we first met, I was always hesitant to tell anyone I worked in this terrible industry. I was a dock worker because we had this bad name by the media. And so when he did ask me, of course, and that question, he then said, "Jim, do you believe in God?" Now that was, I've been brought up in the church, very Protestant, and I really had to struggle because I've been working on the docks for 5 years at this stage, and I really had to struggle because of the compromises and cutting corners I did on the wharf. My faith had worn very thin, so my visits to church were less and less. But I did say yes, I think I believe in God, Tom. Well, he said, "I believe that God has a plan for everyone." And he said, "My wife and I," he said, "we just take a little time in the morning to open our hearts and listen to that inner voice." Some you want to call it their conscience, others might call it God or whatever. But we've found that the thoughts we've got have helped not only our relationship as a husband and wife, but the industry that he worked in. So when I told my wife about this, she'd been doing it hard. We had no made roads where we lived. We were way out in the city. We had no sewerage. One shop about a mile away over muddy fields.
Yes.
And me, when I had to leave and go off to work on a midnight shift, and we had one little child at the time and one on the way, leave her in the garage on her own. So it wasn't easy for her. And when I told her this about listening to that inner voice, she said, "Well, Jim, that would be a better way to start our days than the way we have, because we're having arguments about money or whatever." And so we tried the experiment, and it worked. And I began to get thoughts, and my wife, in the beginning, just ordinary thoughts about our own relationship. For instance, you know, the things you hide from one another. They say molehills build into mountains. And just one issue I had to be honest about. I'd get home at 6 o'clock at night. My wife would say, "What sort of day have I?" "Yeah, pretty." What she didn't know was the ship I'd been working on had finished at 10 o'clock in the morning. And I'd stayed on the job for the rest of the day playing cards with the fellas. So these sort of things built our relationship and our new love. But then I began to think of our extended family, because up until that point, all we'd been worried about was building the house and ourselves as a family. So I began to think of the fellas I worked with every day, and what was my role in helping them to find something new in their lives. So we began to get ideas about the waterfront. Well, I'll tell you one. I had always accused the boss of being dishonest, but it never stopped me stealing his cargo. And I had a thought one day, "Jim, you should return what you've taken."
Because it was a whole culture of pilfering the cargo, right?
That's right, it was a culture. And we didn't see it as going into someone's house and robbing them. We just thought of it's robbing some insurance company, some big unknown society. So we didn't have much conscience about it. And I had this thought I should return what I'd stolen, and I could have lost my job. In fact, even could have gone to jail. Thieving on the waterfront's a pretty serious crime. And I certainly would have lost my job anyway. But, and my mates said to me, "Oh, Jim, you're mad, don't do that, you'll lose your job." But I had this thought, and I thought, well, if God has told me to do this, I should do it. And as it turned out, the general manager of the company that I went and saw, we talked for an hour and a half in his office. At the end of that hour, he said, "I don't know what I can do with this clock that you brought back, but he said, you've given me a new faith in the dock worker, and I just hope that what you're trying to do down there will succeed." And incidentally, I got my nickname out of that because when the wharfies found out that I'd taken one of the things I'd taken back was a clock, they said, "Oh, he's daylight savings now," because I'd put the clock back. But the other one that really did have an effect on the waterfront was I had a thought one day. My father came from the north of Ireland, left there as a 20-year-old, eldest of 10 children. He carried a gun, hated Catholics, and I grew up in a very anti-Catholic Protestant home. When I went to work on the wharf, 50% of the dock workers were all Irish working Catholics. And the leader of them was a very tough person. He was in charge of the toughest section on the waterfront, the coal workers, and he was a professional boxer.
Yes.
And he used to knock my mates out at stockwork meetings if they disagreed. He had a very short fuse, and that was his solution, the fist. And I had no reason to apologise to him because I hated him. But this thought came, and finally I had the courage, and I went and I apologised to him. And he said to me, well, and I said to him, look, I'd like to work with you to build a bit of unity in the port. We had, the union was split in half, the Catholics, the communists, always attacking each other, and using our union as a political football. And I said, he said, well, what's made you get to this point in your life, son? Young fellow, he was much older than me. And I told him about my neighbour and my discussion, and these ideas of MRA, IFC, and how we could build a team on the waterfront that would be positive.
Yes.
Anyway, he said, we'll talk about this later, you know. And I thought, well, that's the end of it, you know. But you know, about 6 weeks later, he came up to me in the port. He said, Jim, that idea we talked about the other night, he said, it works. And I said, Les, what do you mean it works? He said, well, you know Smithy, and Smithy was a very big raw-bone coal worker, the area that he controlled with his fist. And Smithy was more anti-Catholic than I was. And he's having a go at, he said, we're down shoveling coal this night. And he said, Smithy, start to have a go at the Pope. And Les wore his medallion, and he said, don't you say another word against the Pope. If you do, he said, if you don't shut your mouth, I'll shut it for you. Well, Smithy was no cream puff, and he just kept on going. So a fight started, and Les has knocked him out. They get the ambulance down and the first aid to get him out and take him out on the truck. Oh, hoo-ha. Anyway, he said, Jim, I never saw Smithy for about 6 weeks, because in those days we were all casual. You used to go into the pickup centre, get a job, and when you finish that job, you come back into the pickup centre and hope you'll get another job. And you didn't work with the same bloke maybe for months. And he said, as soon as I saw Smithy, I knew I should apologise. And he thought, I'll get him at the smoko break and have a quiet talk with him in the corner. And he said, as if someone had pushed me in the back and said, you knocked him out in front of his peers, go and apologise in front of them. So he said, I walked up to Smithy and all these tough coal workers there, and he said, Smithy, I was supposed to be a Christian the other night and I didn't act like one, I'm sorry. He said, Jim, Smithy grabbed my hand, he said, if you really mean that, Les, I'll never say another thing against your religion. And my friend Les that night learned how to turn an enemy into a friend. But more than that, something happened in his spirit. He lost his hatred of the people on the waterfront that he disagreed with. And he used to go to the opposition and say, look, I knocked you blokes out at stockwork meetings. When you come to, you're still communists and hasn't altered your position, and I know I'm doing it the wrong way. How do we do it together? And in the next 4 or 5 years, we worked together with the ideas of MRA IFC.
Okay.
And we used to bring this centre we're in now, this home, Armour, we used to bring the dock workers and the employers and the foremen and people, we were all...
Yeah, so communist, Catholic...
Oh, the lot, yeah, they were all...
Yes.
And helped them to see things from each other's point of view. And as a result, after about 5 years, it was hard work and some disappointments and that, but we built a team that was strong enough on the waterfront to defeat the communist-controlled union. And Les eventually became president, When he retired, I took over from him. I was Senior Vice President at the time, and I took over from him, and was in that job for the next 25 years.
Yes. So in
And
71 you became president, right?
I became president. I was Senior Vice President in 65, became President in 1971, and my last 8 years on the waterfront, I was the National President
Yes.
of the 60-odd ports around Australia.
Okay.
So it was, but we saw on the waterfront a change in human nature. We introduced ideas. We went to the boss and said, look, we know you've had difficulty with us in the past, but we want to work together to build a better industrial relations here on the waterfront, which is always fraught with strikes. And we had the worst record in the country for industrial disputes. It took us a long while for management to trust us and for us to trust them. But we built this relationship and we began to see wages and conditions go up, strikes go down. It was a win-win on both sides.
Yes.
And I always remember one of the things that always concerned me, in my early days on the wharf, farmers who hated wharfies because of the way we treated them in the past, they would send their fresh cargo down to the wharf. We'd have a bit of a strike. The cargo would go rotten on the wharf and the year's work was finished. And I thought we really should do something about that. And I write a story in my book about it. But just to say, I went up and spoke to the executive of what we call the Northern Fruit Growers Association, the largest exporter of fresh fruit in Australia. And when we got there was 15 on their executive. The bloke who invited me up there, their chairman, was the only one that shook hands with me, and the atmosphere was awful. So before we started our talk, I just said to them, look, I understand that you believe everything that goes wrong on the waterfront is due to my members. And if that is so, we have a new executive there, with new ideas. We want to solve those problems. We want an efficient waterfront which keeps my people in work and your people in work. And sat down. Now, over the next hour or so in our discussions, 9 out of their 10 problems had nothing to do with my union. They were customs problems with government ideas, and anyway, so at the end of the day, they took me, showed their farm to me, and we had lunch together. And as I was leaving, the most antagonistic farmer of them all, who was really wild at the beginning, came up. He said, Jim, I never thought I'd see the day when I'd shake the hand of a wharfie, of a dock worker. And he shook my hand, and I said, well, this is not the end. I said, you know, when your fruit season's finished, I'll invite you and your executive and any farmer who would like to come down. I said, we'll give you lunch in the mess room with the dock workers who load your cargo. And then after you've had and you'll learn their side of the industry. But I said, and then I'll take you up to management and the Port Authority. And you'll see the new relationship we've built with management. Until I retired at the end of 1972, every year a delegation came down and we sent a delegation up to the farmers. And in quite a few areas, and this spread to other ports, we would get farmers to come and work in our job on the wharf, and we'd send wharfies up to work on the farm. And that was quite a... but that was the attitude that had changed on the waterfront.
Yes. Because the farmers actually hated you guys.
Well, you can imagine. I had one fellow rang me, he said, my truck driver's just come back with my year's work. About 40 tonne of fresh fruit. Yes. To be sent overseas.
Yes,
and you fellas have refused to load it. It wasn't true, but these are the sort of experiences they had, and I can understand. And I mean, we thought the farmers too, of course, we had an attitude to them. Oh, they get subsidised with their fuel, and they get subsidised with and they're well looked after. And they drive around in Mercedes-Benz and all that. Not so. I met many farmers who never earned enough to pay tax. You know, and working 15 hours a day, you know.
Exactly.
That gave you a better idea. And my fellas learned to appreciate too
Yes.
the value. And of course, in those days, we lived off the back of the farmers with our wheat and our wool.
Yes, yeah. So the image of the wharfies was quite bad overall, but it changed gradually. The image.
Yes, it did. In 1961, our team elected a new General Secretary. We'd had a Communist General Secretary for 27 years, international communist, a brilliant unionist, but wasn't able to bring about the changes on the waterfront that were necessary. And when we got a new General Secretary, he was a Labor man, very staunch, and he brought our union sort of back from the brink of, not anarchy, but back to the centre of the road. And he was the one that began to introduce new ideas on the waterfront.
Yes.
For instance, he was unhappy with the casualness of the industry, where, and it got so bad at times you may have only got 1 or 2 days work a week. So, and if the foreman, when you went in to get a job at the pickup centre, get up on a box, if he didn't like you, you never got a job.
Okay. Yeah.
He'd pick his friends and his mates. So it was an industry of chaos, and that assisted the wrong people in charge of our union to foster the hatred of the boss. So from that, he introduced permanency. So every waterside worker became permanently employed with one of the stevedoring companies. And of course, when you work permanently for the one person or the one company, you develop a relationship there. Whereas if you only work for them once every few months, you have no connection. So that changed a lot of the atmosphere and a lot of the... And we introduced productivity schemes that was a win for both sides. It increased the productivity, but also increased our wages.
Okay. Yes.
We didn't work any longer hours, but we just were productive in those times that we worked.
Yes.
And it also built a new relationship between the worker and the foreman and the supervisors and people in charge of it.
And you're talking in the book also about like a whole family culture, more or less, that existed among the workers, the wharfies.
Well, as I said to you, when we first went there, my fiancée and I decided we'd spend a few years there, make a bit of money and then leave, because it was such a difficult industry. But you know, the mateship that existed down there was unbelievable. There was no pay for sick leave. If you got crook, you would just had to live off your own or borrow money. But the wharfies, anyone in your gang, everyone could.
President of the Union of Waterside Workers, and then you were visiting other ports as well all over the world. So you went to London, to Rotterdam, and later also to New York, for example.
Yeah, and my purpose in visiting these ports was to pass on my experience of change through and talk about the ideas of initiatives of change, MRA, and you know, they listened. I'm not going to say every port I went to we had a success story, but there were many we didn't. And I remember going to Liverpool. They just had a 6-week strike. Only the Port of Liverpool was on strike. They just introduced permanent employment there. But Liverpool, they had an unofficial strike, as much against the union as it was against the boss. And I was invited to go and speak to the general manager, called Leggett, and I spent an hour with him in his office. He spent the first 20 minutes complaining about the dockers, how productivity had gone down even though they'd introduced this permanent employment and better, you know, he said, we've given them everything, new equipment and all this. I said, you never gave it to them. I said, they had to fight for it. And you wouldn't have given it to them if they hadn't fought for it. And then after a while I said, do you know any of the dockers in the port? He'd been there, working on the wharf for 40 years and never met a dock worker. He said, oh, I wouldn't know how to talk to one anyway. I said, you've just been talking to one for an hour. So, anyway, I said, who should I see in the Dock Workers Union? So he gave me the name of the chairman of the strike committee. an Irishman called Cat Kelly,
Mm.
and he said he's a real troublemaker, you know. So I went along and I met Pat, and we had just introduced permanent employment here in Australia,
Mm.
but we did it without any strike, without any unrest.
Yeah.
He said, how did you do that? I said, well, we have a system in Australia where every ship has got a delegate, and those delegates meet every month, and it took us 6 months to negotiate, or our employers, our union officials, 6 months to negotiate the permanency agreement. And they had to do it with the rest of the trade union movement, the Australian Council of Trade Unions here, and with management, and with the port users, like the farmers. So it was a whole group of people sitting down trying to work out how we could introduce permanent employment.
Yes.
And I said our delegates were involved in that,
Mm.
so that every month they would get a report and they would come back on the job and have meetings with the men.
Mm.
So everyone knew where we were at each stage, so they were informed.
Yes.
And they said, well, we've never had anything like that.
Mm.
So we talked more about the change and that, and then Pat said, look, would you meet my executive,
Mm.
the strike committee?
Mm.
And the strike was over, of course, and I said, oh yeah. Anyway, a few days later, we met with the executive, and some of them quite radical, and at the end of our couple of hours discussion, and the most, I say, difficult of them all, said, you know, if we'd have met you earlier, we may not have had that 6-week strike.
Mm.
You know, this was, and anyway, I left London about 2 weeks later, and I got a phone call from the manager's office to say that for the first time in the port, productivity had gone up,
Yes.
and that Kelly had been appointed
Mm.
a delegate to negotiate
Yeah.
around the port.
Yeah.
So there were stories like that we had in a number of ports, and
Yes.
others where we saw personal change,
Mm.
and you began to understand. The leading dock worker in France, from Nantes, called Nantes, he pioneered in the union movement there.
Mm.
And I said to him, you know, do you see much difference in the old trade union and the new?
Mm.
He said, yes, I do, Jim. He said, in the early days, and I knew too, he said, you were struggling for wages,
Mm.
and the unity and mateship and comradeship of the workers was great.
Mm.
Now, he said, what are they fighting for? A second car in the family, or a
Okay.
boat,
Yes. Yes.
or the whiz-bang TV set.
Yes. Yes.
He said, and that doesn't unite people.
Ah.
Greed takes over, and you begin to,
Mm.
and I think this is what materialism can take over anyone,
Yes.
whether it's a boss or a worker.
Yes. Yes.
And once materialism grabs you,
Ah.
the issues of fairness and all that disappear.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a big change what you see in these days as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the work is easy, of course. There's no manual work on the waterfront,
Mm.
and it's all. And of course, it's becoming even more so. We've got a ship now, and they've been operating around the world for years.
Mm.
Totally automated. The ship
Yeah.
comes in, and we don't even have someone here in Australia. If someone on a computer in Singapore
Mm.
is unloading the ship,
Yes. Yes.
loads it on a conveyor belt, takes it down. A driverless straddle truck will come and pick it up and
Yes.
deposit it where it needs to go, and then a truck driver will come down and take it away.
Yeah. So no physical labor. In it.
Yeah. And I think what management missed out on was they thought the quicker we get rid of the workforce,
Mm.
the more productivity we'll have.
Mm.
What they didn't realise was if they were treating the workforce properly, then productivity would be there.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I know many of the ships we were on, there was some good foremen and there was some bad foremen.
Mm.
The good foreman knew the blokes, understood their needs, and how he appreciated their skills,
Mm.
and the productivity on their ships would be up.
Okay.
The foreman who didn't give a stuff and
Yes. Yes.
productivity would be down because there was no appreciation of what you did.
Mm. Ah.
And, so this is where today I'm afraid materialism is gripping them. And,
Mm. So you don't see so much more anymore that collective, what you had back in the day, that you had like a, like what you said, like family culture, a collective feeling of being part of something. You
Yeah.
feel like it's becoming disintegrated in a way,
That's
like
right.
everywhere. And you were telling the other way, and you're writing about it, that the Wharfies were also putting themselves for a collective cause. For example, when there was the independence war in Indonesia, they put a ban on shipping
Yeah.
or loading the warships
Yeah.
of war material for Dutch.
Yeah. We all have always had a social conscience about whether they were local or international. And with Indonesia, when the Dutch tried to dominate and control Indonesia, and they felt the time had come when they should have their independence, my union made a decision nationally that no cargo of any shape that was going to Indonesia to assist the Dutch, whether it was arms or whatever, we would refuse to load it.
Yes.
And as a result, I mean, it hurt our union. We got fined and all sorts of things because we refused. But at the end of the day, Indonesia got its independence. In fact, your president made comments about the union and its involvement with your independence.
Okay. Yes.
And it did, it meant something to the people of Indonesia. And I'm saying the same with South Africa. In 1961, a South African trade union leader came to Australia, and we asked him to come down on the wharf, and we had 3 ships tied up at the 3 berths, and 300 men, 100 men off each ship came to listen to this fellow at lunchtime. At the end of the meal break, we'd never heard about apartheid. No, nothing on. So we extended our lunch hour for half an hour to hear more from the black South African trade union leader. When we all went back to work, we all got sacked. And the next day, we were automatically fined £500, the union.
Okay.
And as a result of that, the union stopped the port. That night in the newspapers, Wharfies on strike over apartheid. And we were out for 4 days on that issue. And unbeknownst to us...
So there's a title in the newspaper?
Oh no, yeah, headline news, Wharfies still on strike over apartheid. And so it raised the issue nationally here. And someone must have got word through to Mandela, who was in jail, at a point in his career wondering whether he'll ever get out. What's the future for South Africa? And he got this report. An unknown union on the other side of the world had raised nationally the question of apartheid. And that was the beginning of it sort of becoming an international issue. And our union, of course, became very heavily involved then in really the destruction of apartheid.
Yes.
So we've not, and there are many national issues. The Aboriginal, for instance, our union has played a major role in their movement forward, and still got a long way to go. But the union's pushing now, and I think we'll find in the new government, if it's a Labor one, we'll have them recognised in the Constitution.
Do you think that consciousness comes from the fact that the Wharfies was a group of people with so many different backgrounds as well, that they worked together, and once somebody was in a way hurt or felt I had to take on this task, the whole family was thinking, okay, we need to support each other.
When I started on the wharf in '51, after the war, 51, we saw a huge migration of people from Europe. And so over 50% of the workforce on the waterfront, when I started there, were people born overseas.
So
So
like
we had a
Italians,
big international,
Greeks.
from every country, and so we had that international. And when I became president, we began and we introduced, it wasn't many years that we introduced permanent employment, and we used to train our members. We had a national training college here in Melbourne, so we'd bring new dock workers from all around Australia to do training courses here, how to drive the cranes, how to and we would go down and address them.
Mm.
And myself as president, I would say, now, you don't need to worry about your wages or your conditions.
Mm.
That's our job.
Mm.
And if we don't do it well enough for you, you can vote us out every 3 years.
Mm.
But what we want in return from you is a good day's work for the boss.
Mm.
Because if you don't give him a good day's work and he's going out of business, you've lost your job, he might go out of business too. But we've got to... So we challenged our members, and as a result of that, management literally handed us the discipline of our members.
Mm.
So if any bloke broke the rules or something, it wasn't the boss that dealt with them.
Yes.
He'd give them a slap on the wrist, but we might suspend them for a few days or
Yes.
a week or whatever. So the trust between management grew out of that too, because they knew the training that, and we ran the school.
Mm.
Management financed it, but we ran it.
Mm.
And they realised that we were pointing in the right direction.
Yes, yeah. Okay. And like when you were national president one time, you also went to New York, right? One time to the port of New York.
Yeah.
And I think the mayor, the Republican Rudolph Giuliani was there as well, right? And
Yeah, well,
you spoke there? Or?
Yeah, I went and was a guest of honour at the breakfast before the Labor Day March down Fifth Avenue.
Yes.
So, and the guest speaker was Giuliani.
Mm. He was the mayor at the time.
He was the mayor at the time,
Yeah.
and I couldn't work out why a Republican would speak at a Labor dinner, you see, or breakfast. And but after I heard him speak, I realised why. And he said, you know, since I've been mayor, he said, I've been most highly supported by the trade union movement, particularly here in New York. He said, and I owe a lot. He said, my mother was a garment worker, belonged to the Garment Workers Union, and because the Garment Workers Union helped finance my education, I owe a lot to the union movement.
Yeah, exactly.
And he said the crime rate in New York has gone down since I've been mayor because the union movement, whenever I've called them together to sort out a problem, we've resolved it. And that's encouraged the business community to bring more work back into New York. And we're one of the few cities in America at this time that the labour force is coming up.
Okay.
We're getting more workers now.
Yes, yeah.
So it was very interesting. I'm a bit disappointed with him now with Trump, but I think that was a wonderful experience for me to think that someone, and because the Labor invited him to be their guest speaker.
Yes.
Quite something of that.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And then you were also involved in prison reforms.
Yes, I belong to an organisation called the Prisoners' Aid Society, and they looked after the welfare of prisoners' families, not the prisoner. Because when someone's arrested, they go to jail, roof over their head, 3 meals a day. What happens to their family? They can't get social services for 3 weeks. You've got kids, they've got no house over the roof over there. So I got involved, and then I realised that prisoners would make artifacts, tables and toys and all that, A, for their family, or B, they'd give it to the prison officer to go out and sell it. He might get $20 for it and give them about $2. And I thought, this is not right, we've got to do something about this. So we had a union department store run by the trade unions, and they decided that all the stuff that was made by prisoners, we would take it into our shop and we would retail it, no charge, and the money that we got for that would go back to the families. Anyway, it turned out it was a multi-million-dollar industry.
Okay.
And they put a blocker on it because from the governor of the jail down to the ordinary prison officer, I'm making fortunes.
Okay, yeah.
So I started to make a noise about it at Trades Hall because I was their representative. I was the Trades Hall Council representative on prison work.
Yes.
Then I got a ring from the minister to say, Jim, I believe you're unhappy about. I said, I certainly am, and I'm not going to. He said, well, look, would you join a tripartite committee the chairman of the Employers Federation, you representing the unions, and the head of the finance department for the state. So for 2 years we sat on a committee to develop industries in our prisons. And we formed a prison industries commission, of which I was part of. And our first year of operation, we got just over $10 million to build factories in our various prisons. It was our role to see what industries you put in what prisons, and they're all over the state. And every year they returned more than they got from the government and we also had to watch that we didn't take a job away from a law-abiding citizen.
Okay,
Because the wages of prisoners in those days was 32 cents an hour, and we could produce it quite cheap. So all we could build was import replacement. So if someone was importing something, we'd build it for the same price.
Okay.
And so I got involved, and I spent nearly 30 years involved with prison work. And,
Yes.
yeah.
You also went to Tokyo to see the prisons there, right?
Amazing. Yeah. The prison in Tokyo had about 8,000 prisoners when I was there. And they had a different system to us, of course. No smoking, very disciplined, but they were more interested in rehabilitation. They felt that this fella's committed a crime, we've got to develop his character and make sure he doesn't do it again.
Yeah.
It wasn't always successful, but their industries, the money they made from them, was given to the government. They got very little of it, but then when they left the industry, left the prison, they had some money. Now what we felt with ours, because we have a very high recidivism where prisoners come in, they get out and they come back again. And when we started our prison industries, it was about 70% of the prisoners would go back into jail after 12 months. When we introduced our industries, they learned a skill, because we had 100 teachers go in, teaching them the trades that they needed to learn.
So what were the specific trades, for example?
Oh, well, horticulture,
Okay.
metal industry, carpentry. There was about 14 different industries we had working there. So and the teachers that came in to teach were qualified teachers that could give them a certificate when they left. So they had if they were a boilermaker, they had a boilermaker certificate, 5 class or whatever it was that they went out with. So that meant that when they came out, A, they had a skill, but B, we had a system where we had people coming into the jail, and their role was as a social worker, and they would look after a prisoner. So they get to know him in jail, and they get to know his family. And many prisoners, their families don't want to see them again. But so they built that relationship, it could have been built, but also they got a job for them. They'd visit factories and farm and find a job for these fellows. And but governments are pretty pig-headed at times, and it was going to cost $150,000 for a welfare worker to do this work. But at the end of a year, they would be so skilled in their work, they would be able to look after 12 prisoners. Now at that time, it was costing us $90,000 a year to keep a prisoner in jail. More than that.
So you would save enough.
So it'd be more economical to have someone that kept in touch with these when they came out and kept them working and involved and taxpayers. But yeah, so I spent 30 years involved with prison work as a trades hall rep.
But now that's all because it became privatised, right?
Well, we had a Conservative Premier came in and he decided that he wanted to privatise our prisons. And virtually overnight, half of our prisons went from public prisons to private prisons, simply because the private prisons said to the government, we'll house a prisoner for $35,000 a year. The public system was costing about $45,000 a year at that time. And of course he was only interested in commercial ventures. And sadly, of course, the only way he could do that was to reduce the prison officers,
Oh, yes.
the staff
Yeah.
that was supposed to. So we had more riots
Yeah, so after the recidivist
in the private prisons.
came higher again.
Yeah. But my argument used to be too to the union blokes who were working in the prison industry. They were all members of the police association, not the police, prison officers association. And my argument, because they took the job a bit too easy, some of them. It was trying to convince, what I did on the waterfront, convince our blokes it was a two-way street, you know. You had to contribute to your job and do it the best you could so that when you retired, you could hand it on to the next generation of dock workers. The prison officers took the job too in the government departments. Couldn't get the sack because it was a government job and they didn't do the productivity that they could have done. And I used to remind them whenever I met with them at a few meetings, they sort of said, oh no, our job's going to go on forever. So sadly today half our prisons are privately run and not very well run.
Yeah, no, that's
And
important.
recidivism has gone up again because my committee, the Prison Industries Commission, and we had someone representing education, someone management, someone farming. We had a whole range of qualified people on that committee of mine, and I represent the trade union movement. And our role was to report to the minister, not to go back to the bureaucrats. We bypassed them, and they got a very savage. I'm a bit annoyed with us. They weren't being involved in, and we ran a very, very tight shop. And our industries, we met every month, and we go and have our monthly meetings in the prisons around the state, and get to know the prisoners, get to know management, and the supervisors in charge of the prisons. And it took us a while to establish it because the governor and the prison officers, here's a new group of people coming in supervising their prisoners in industry, and it was a bit of a skin off their nose. So it took us a while to get it working properly and a sense of unity between because our blokes weren't disciplinarians, they were just teachers. And
I also think like it becomes the responsibility of the whole society all of a sudden because you bring in teachers, you bring in like all other aspects you bring into the prison to lift the people up again. Well, if you don't do it, it's only falls on their shoulders, and they can't lift themselves maybe out of it anymore.
Well, and one of the things too is we have various organisations where it's an international organisation which I helped to start here in Victoria called Prisoners Aid Society, and it's a Christian-based organisation that they go and send their people into the prisons every day of the week, and they have meetings with prisoners, sometimes as an individual, helping to develop their faith and develop a relationship with their family and support their family while they're in jail and when they come out. And it's one of the most successful prisoners aid groups I know of. We've got a number here in Australia, and I'm very pleased that it was part of that. So that's one of the positives. But if we don't, I've always said, it's the people who look after the prisoners that they don't get enough training. They are not skilled in their job, and some of them go into the job for ulterior motives and not for the right reasons. And you've got to, you know, if you're going to become a prison officer, you've got to be committed to it. Because if you've got a rapist who bashed a child or something, he's got 13 years jail. That's about what life sentence is these days. So he's coming into your jail. You're going to have him there for 13 years. Do you say to yourself, for what this bastard's done, I'm going to give him the worst 13 years he's ever experienced? Or am I going to try and help him change and be a different person so he goes out a much different person? And sadly, there's no training, or very little training in that sphere for our prison officers who have the day-to-day touch
Yes.
with that prisoner.
So you see a little bit, in a way, you see that training, like at first you talked about the training, for example, of the wharfies, that helped them a lot to grow, for example, and to become even
Absolutely.
bigger.
Yeah.
You see that also that should be maybe implemented in the prison system as well.
I think in most positions you'll find that they've, because I always said, and I still do, a poor worker quite often represents a poor boss. If you've got a good boss that understands his workers and their needs, encourages the best out of them. Bad boss doesn't,
Okay, yeah.
and they react.
Okay, yeah.
And I feel that that's one of the keys. And what encourages me and inspires me is that if someone like me, apathetic, uneducated, I never had an education, I left school at 15, had no, very shy and backward in many ways. If someone like me can change, then I think anyone can change and make a difference and build a better world. And after all, this is what we're about, you know. And I belong to many organisations, but the thing I felt with IFC MRA is that it wants to see the world different, and I think we all do. But MRA, IFC says to you, when you start with yourself, you put right where you feel you can put things right, and you'll be amazed at. And my sister used to say, "How does Jim ever become the president?" He was such a shy and backward sort of lad, and I was very much a mummy's boy, really, you know, because I was the youngest of our family, and you know, people say to me even now, how on earth, as a Christian, did you ever become the president of the most militant union in Australia?
Yes, yes.
And my answer is, and always has been, it wasn't in spite of my faith, but because of it.
Okay.
And I hoist my flag as a Christian from the very beginning when I changed and began to be a positive element on the wharf. And I discovered that the fellas, you know, over 50% of the blokes who used to come into my office, they weren't worried about their wages or their conditions. They had family problems. Wife was going to leave home, daughters in the family were not married, son's in trouble with the police, or they got troubles with the neighbours. So you had to become a father confessor and all that sort of thing. And a lot of my trade union colleagues at our Trades Hall Council, we used to meet every Thursday night, 176 different trade union leaders would gather, and they would say, "Oh, Jim, don't waste your time on those sort of things. Our role is to look after their wages and their conditions." And my answer was always, if that's all the trade union movement means to you, you've lost the plot. The trade union movement's there to look after the whole of the person and his family, not just his wage and condition. That's, anyone can do that.
Yes.
But, and you know, when I first got elected president as a full-timer, I used I worked a 60 to 70 hour week right up until I died. I left the waterfront 25 years later as president. But I would visit prisoners, visit wharfies in their homes, in the hospital, and it was very costly to my family.
Okay.
You know, I mean, my kids, I used to go to Sydney for national conferences, and I missed my kids' birthdays for just on 20 years.
Yes, yes.
Never had a birthday with them. And of course I'd leave home at 6 o'clock, 6:30 in the morning,
Yes.
dark.
Yeah.
I'd come home at night at 7 o'clock.
But apparently
Yes,
you really
yeah.
fell for this man. Yeah,
Oh, well,
so-
you see, my wife Tui was so convinced that IFC, MRA was the way we wanted to live, and based our faith on moral values,
Yes.
you know, honesty,
Yes.
purity,
Yeah.
unselfishness, love. No one can argue about those sort of standards. And I mean, we can't live up to them, but you can try.
Yes.
It always reminded me of the early seafarers used to find their way by the star, and
Yes.
no one's ever recorded them reaching that star, but that was their guide.
Yes.
And I feel with these moral values, and that's, see, one of the problems we have. When I look back over my 68 years of involvement with the trades union movement, I look back at the beginning of the trades union movement, which was formed over 150 years ago, and the pioneers in those days were men of spirit. I'm not talking about religion, I'm talking men who had a spiritual experience. And you look at the Tolpuddle martyrs and people like that, who their philosophy was the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God. Though many of them were lay preachers that were inspired by Wesley and others who said, form into, they called them chapels in those days, where you can collectively go to your employer and say, this is not right, we shouldn't have this. Individually, they couldn't do it. So collectively they had to do it. And that's what started the trades union movement, to deal with the selfishness of people. And they paid a price. They, in many cases, the secretaries and those that started the unions weren't paid, they just lived off gifts from members of the union that supported them. And I think of one fellow that came to me when I was president and said, I'd like to help you in your work on the wharf, Jim. He was a wharf, or a rough diamond. And I wasn't sure whether he, so I said, well, if you mean you want to get a full-time job as a union official, you'll have to take a $10,000 a year cut in your wages, because that's how much less I get than you get as a wharfie, because, and I said, you'll work a 60 or 70 hour week in this job, you work a 35 hour week. And I said, the union will give you a motor car and the telephone, but that's so you can, 4,500 wharfies will have your phone number, so they can ring you and get you back on the job every day. And he said, I'll give it a go. Now there weren't too many fellows who were prepared to make that sort of sacrifice. And but that was the state of play in the early days. People sacrificed to become an official, not to find a stepping stone into politics like many of them do now, or well paid and gold cards and all the things, overseas trips. So when I look back and I think of that pioneering spirit of the early pioneers in the union movement, that's what I'd like to see happen again in the union movement. Because materialism can grab anyone, whether you be a boss or a worker. And I think that's what's taking over society today, where we want to get more than we give. And someone said about IFC MRA, it's a bit like boxing. I think it was Robinson, Sugar Ray Robinson. He said, MRA is a bit like boxing. If you're going to be successful, you've got to learn to give more than you take. And I think societies now, as individuals, we've got to learn to give more than we take.
Okay. Well, that's a very interesting end point I think you make here. Oh, thank you very much, Jim. I found it very fascinating and insightful, also into the history of the wharfies, but also your involvement with IFC and Moral Rearmament. So thank you very much for your time.
And thank you for your patience, Chris.
Yeah, no worries.
Nice to see a young fellow like you taking on the battle.
Yes. Well, thank you.
Good on you,
Cheers.
mate.
Yes.
Yeah.